Hello there and welcome to part 2 of my XNA tutorial. Now that we have introduced ourselves to the basic mechanisms of drawing and moving stuff around, we should pay a moment for structuring our project properly. I think this is one of the biggest issues that newcomers have when they have completed the basic tutorials of a development environment, in this case XNA, and they want to start their own project. It's just that they don't really know where to begin or how to really make it. I must say there's not just one way to do it, and the method I'm going to introduce in a bit probably isn't the best way to do it, but it has worked for me and many others before, so why not give it a try? Basically, we want to separate our game into smaller chunks. That way we can develop the game one small thing at a time. Also, the changes we make in one component will have minimal impact on the non-related components. Now you might ask, why can't we just keep making things like we did in part 1? Like writing variables after another, do things to them in update method and draw them in the draw method. Well, this is basically what we're doing anyway, but imagine a situation where you have hundreds of game objects and each of them has countless variables. You would end up with thousands of lines of code in a single file, which would be an unmitigated disaster. Now, how should we break our game down? Well, let me tell you my way. I like to have a main controller which is responsible for handling the bigger image of the game. Then there's controllers for player, game logic, cameras, lighting, physics and so on. The amount of controllers isn't as important since you will be making only the ones you need, and you might be combining some controllers together. The important thing is to have clearly defined roles for each of your controllers. Now, as we are experiencing with XNA here, I like to use a controller called Screen Controller. Basically, it controls the scenes or levels of the game. And when the game is launched, the screen controller will show you the main menu, and when the player starts a new game, the controller closes the menu screen and creates a new game screen for level 1, and so on. I think that covers up the theory for now. Let's make it happen. So, let's create a new project like we did last time. Select New Project, select Windows Game 4.0 and name it as you like. I'll name it XNA Tutorial Part 2 and click OK, and there we have our project. Now here in XNA Tutorial Part 2, right click on your project, select Add and New Item. Be sure it's class here and name it as Game Controller and enter. Here we have our Game Controller class. You can go up here and type using Microsoft.xna.framework and make your class public class so we won't run into any problems later on. Now type drawable game component here, so our game controller will inherit the drawable game controller. And now let's make our constructor here. It's public game controller and the first parameter is game. And let's call base with our game parameter there. And you can save the class now. And let's add the good old methods we know. And those would be initialize. By the way, you can just type override here and press space and it'll give you the list of the overrideable methods. Initialize was the first, then load content, update, and finally, draw. There we go, and save. This will be our main game controller class like I talked about earlier. This will control our whole game later on. Now, let's go inside the methods and type some console messages. Like for instance here, we can type console.writeLine GC initialization, and let's copy it and paste it here, and GC load content, GC update. Actually, I won't do this just yet. Here we have, and let's put one here as well. GC Constructor. Oops, Constructor. Now, here we have our basic structure for our game controller. Now let's go back into the game1.cs and let's enter a few empty lines here and write game controller. And inside public game1, enter a few empty lines and type game controller equals new game controller. And as game parameter, give this. And next you can just write this.components.add game controller. This will tell the XNA engine that game controller is a drawable game component, and it automatically calls the initialize, load content, update and draw methods for us. So we don't have really care about calling them. Now you can save your game.cs method, and you can actually just paint draw, update, unload content, load content and initialize methods and erase them. This is our game1 class right now. And let's click play here. Here we have our game window, and here we have our output, which tells us GC Constructor, GC Initialization and GC Load Content. Just like we wrote here. Whoops. Here are our console write lines, and we just saw them in the debug output. Nice, it'll work. It works just like we intended. That's good juice. We can also try this. Erase the comments from here. Now it should print this line quite a few times, like we see here. Yep. It works. It calls the update method, just like we want. The next part is that you might actually wonder why the screen isn't blue like it was earlier. Well, this is because we erased the graphicsDevice.clear line that cleared the screen with blue sky core. Now we can do that exact same thing here in game controller class. We can just add a few lines and take game.graphicsDevice.clear and give it color.cornflower blue. And we can test it, and there we go. A nice sky blue screen. And then this output screen is popping up constantly. Well, anyways, now we have a nice game controller class, but it doesn't really do that much. We should add more things to our game, so let's create a new class for all the player-related stuff. This class will handle the user input, play actions, and finally draws our player on the screen. So let's get cracking. Let's create a new class called player. And let's see. I lost my train of thought. Let's change this to public, and this time we won't inherit the drawable game component. And you might wonder why not? And the answer is simple. The more you have drawable game components in your game, the more it needs resources. You can have some amount of these components, but the smaller the count is, the better. That's why we're going to take advantage of our game controller to call the player classes draw and update methods. This way we get the same functionality as we would get if player class did inherit the drawable game component class, but we save some valuable computing resources. Okay, so let's continue. First, create a new member variable for the game controller, like this, private game controller. Now let's make the constructor, which is public player, and the first and only parameter is game controller. Let's shorten it to GC. And here we type this dot game controller is GC. Now the player class can call game controller whenever it needs. This is pretty much important for, like, if your player shoots a monster, it can inform the game controller about this event. Next, we create all the needed methods here, but without the override keyword, since we don't have any methods to override this time. You can still use the same method names for convenience, so let's create public void initialize, public void load content, public void update game time, and let's resolve this by using Microsoft.xna.framework. There, and finally public void draw and game time. There we go. And in the game controller class we add a new member variable called player, and here in the game controller constructor type player equals new player and this. There we go. And actually we can create a new public accessor for the player. So just type here first private and then the public player and get return player. There we go, just in case we need that. And there we go. Now, if you have done any XNA stuff before, you know that this approach is a bit suboptimal. You shouldn't really load the content in every implemented class, but have a content manager class instead. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to leave the player class's load content method here, and we will implement the content manager class later. So now we have our player class ready to be filled with our player-related game logic. But first, let's create the screen manager I already mentioned earlier, and let's also create a class called game screen. This will represent a single scene of our game. Your game might have hundreds of scenes, or it might just as well have only one. Despite the count of scenes, it's good to make this screen system properly. So let's add a new class, yet again. And this time we call it screen controller. And just like with the player class, let's not implement the drawable game component, but instead just write public there and again we add a new game controller member variable called game controller, and again make it the constructor screen controller game control GC. This dot game controller is GC. There we have our little game controller, apparently. And what do we have here? Let's see. I have to go through my notes here. for a sec. Yeah, let's add all the other methods as well. So public void initialize, public void load content. Actually, we don't need this, but hey, why not? Public void update game time, and finally public void draw game time, and resolve the game time problem like this. There we go. Now let's add the game screen class. Select add new class, new item, select class here and name it game screen. Again, public class game screen, and this time the member variable isn't the game controller but the screen controller, so just type private screen controller, and we can just as well make a public accessor here. So public screen controller, get return screen controller. There. And make your constructor here as well. Public game screen controller sc, and this dot screen controller is sc. Whoops. There we go. And let's add all the familiar methods again. Public void initialize, public void update, public void draw. Oh, the game time variables. Yeah. And I'll just copy paste this here and resolve the problem. There we go. And of course go to screen controller and we make a public accessor here. Public game controller, and get return game controller. Now this way we can actually call methods of the game controller class directly from our game screen class, if we need that kind of stuff. Now that we have the game screen class, we have to add it to our screen controller. We could do something like this. This is pretty simple. Just write game screen here, and inside the constructor we add screen is new game screen, this. But this kind of approach isn't that dynamic, as you would only have one screen, and it would be quite problematic if you wanted to have more screens. For example, one for your game and one for your in-game menu. So let's delete these lines, and instead we add a list of type game screen called screens, like this. And then we can add a public accessor just in case we need one. There we go. And we also need 2 or 3 methods for our screens. Let's add them here. The first one is add screen, which simply adds a new screen to our list. And let's make sure that we don't add the same screen twice. So let's make a check like this: if screens contains screen, and there's the exclamation mark here. So it checks that if it doesn't contain it, then we can just type screens.add screen. And the next one is the opposite, remove screen. Let's check if the screens list contains the screen. We can't remove it if it doesn't contain it. Then we can just type screens.remove screen. There we go. And this way we can actually have multiple screens. We can, for example, have all our levels loaded up simultaneously, or we can have, like I said earlier, one screen for our game screen and one for our in-game menu, or we can even split things up for different layers. Like, for example, we can have the main game running on one screen and our user interface running on another. Simple as that. Now, inside the draw method of our screen controller, we make a loop, for each loop, like this. For each game screen, screen in screens. This will iterate over the screens in our screens list. We make a check if screen.isActive is true, then screen.draw. And we of course don't have the isActive variable in our game screen, so let's add it here. Let's make it public bool isActive is equals true, like this. Now we can toggle screens on and off just the way we want. So if screen is active, then we can draw it. And let's make a similar for loop here in the update method. If for each game screen, screen in screens, if screen.isActive, screen.update game time. There we go. Now we update all the active screens and draw all the active screens. That was a bit redundant sentence, but hey, doesn't really matter. Let's see, what do we have next? Before we can make anything cool happen, we still need to add some little things here and there. The first thing is to add a sprite patch to our screen controller. So let's go up here and let's make it here. Let's create a new member variable for our sprite batch, like this. Sprite batch, and let's resolve the problem here by using framework.graphics. And inside the initialize method, let's type sprite batch equals new sprite batch. And we have to give it a graphics device. This can be achieved like this. Let's write this.gamecontroller.graphicsDevice. There we go. Also, let's make this sprite batch a private variable and let's make a public accessor. Like this. Because we need this later on. There we go. Now, let's do the same stuff we did in the first part of this tutorial. Again, I create a new folder here. Add a new folder and call it textures. And I have already my folder here, and here's the good old sphere image. I just drag it here. And I have the sphere.png there. Now let's go to the player class and add two new variables here. The first is private texture 2D texture and resolve the problem. And the next one is private vector 2 position, just like we had in the first part. And in the initialize method, let's type position equals new vector 2, and let's give the initial position for our sphere, like we did last time, 300, 200. Cool. And in the load content, we have to load the texture. And it happens like this. Texture equals this dot game controller dot game dot content. And the type is texture 2D, and the path is texture slash sphere. Notice that the .png doesn't come here like this. Leave it out. It won't load the file correctly if you put that in there. Now this, for some reason, says I have a problem here. Forgot the load method here. Whoopsie! So the whole thing here is gamecontroller.game.content.load. And texture 2D is the type of an asset we're loading, and here's the path to our sphere image. Okay, inside the update method, let's add the keyboard input events. So type keyboard and resolve using framework.input and keyboard. Whoops. Let's erase that. Let's type if keyboard.getState is key down keys.left position.x minus equals 2f. And if keyboard.getState is key down keys right position.x plus equals 2f. Let's leave the y part out, because you already know how to do it. So, let me go through my notes for a sec. Yeah, before we draw anything here, let's recall how the sprite batch works. First we have to call the sprite batch.begin. Let's go here, and I'll just show you. For example here, we have to call sprite batch.begin, then we have to draw our stuff here, like this, and then we call sprite batch.end. Now, we could add these to our player's draw method here, like sprite batch and begin and so on, but as we already said earlier, we want to save resources and make as few external method calls as possible, and again sprite batch.begin and .end are a bit resource hog-ish method calls, so we want to call them as few times as possible. So in GameScreen class, we call the begin, screen controller class. Here in draw method, we call, for each screen, we add here sprite batch.begin just before the screen.draw. Whoops, I meant we have to go to the game screen here, and here we take screen controller.spritebatch.begin, and here draw all the screen's stuff, and here we call sprite batch again and call end, like this. Now, let me go again through my notes. Here between the begin and end method calls, we add our player method call, player draw call, like this screen controller.gamecontroller.player.draw. And let's give the game time parameter there. And actually we have to make a slight change here in the player class. Let's take the draw method and add another parameter here, which is sprite batch. Let's call it SB for short. And here in the game screen, let's add the sprite batch, like screenController.spriteBatch. There we go. And in the draw method here, we can just simply write sb.draw. And here we give the texture, we want the position, we want, whoops, we have already the position, and the tinting color, which is color.white. There we go. And now we have about one more thing to do. We need to add the screen controller's method calls into the game controller. So let's do that. Here in initialize we call screenController.initialize. In update we call screenController.update. And finally, here, I'm in the wrong file. This is game screen. Whoops! Well, this happens. Let's go to the game controller. And here in the initialize we call screen controller. Actually, we don't have the screen controller here, so we have to add it first. Let's add private screen controller. And here in the constructor we add screen controller is new screen controller, this screen controller.initialize screen controller.load content screen controller.update with game time, and finally screen controller.draw. Now let's follow this path here. Here we have the initialize method for screen controller. We call it, here's the screen controller, initializes the sprite batch. In game controller we call screen controller.update. Here in screen controller.update we have the screen update call, and here in the screen we call the updates for our stuff. Here we can actually add the screen controller.gamecontroller.player.update. This way we get the player updated. And again, in game controller class we have the draw method. We call screen controller.draw. In screen controller, in the draw method we call the screen.draw, and in game screen we start the sprite batch and draw our stuff we need to draw in that screen. Well, that seems like it should work. Let's test it. Let's click play. And we have a invalid operation exception. The graphics device property cannot be used before initialize has been called. Well, I guess we have a simple solution for that. We just take this screen controller.initialize and put it here after the base.initialize. Let's test it out. And there we have. But we don't get the sphere appear. This is a bit problematic. So let's go. We can actually comment this one out. And let's start following our code. Where's the problem? Here's the draw method. Let's check if we get it called. gcDraw. And let's go to view output and let's click play. Output gcDraw. Cool. The draw method gets called, and it should call also the screen controller.draw. let's go to the draw method. For each game screen in screens. Can you already guess what's wrong with this? We don't have any screens in the screens list. Well, that's a bit of a problem. So, in the initialize method, let's call screen controller.add screen new game screen. Like this. And screen controller. And let's test it out. And again, null reference exception. We have to call the... Where was it again? Game screen.update. Screen controller.gamecontroller.player.update. I guess game controller's player is the one that is null at the moment. Well, it shouldn't be because it's initialized here. Screen controller is initialized here. Let's see. Console.writeLine. Screen controller, short for SC, is screen controller. Console.writeLine. GC is screen controller.gamecontroller. And finally, player is screen controller.gamecontroller.player. This is the way how you should debug this kind of problems. And if we open the output, we can see here that SC is the null one. And why is that? Because in the public game screen we don't call this.screenController is SC. Now let's see if it works. And of course it doesn't work. This method doesn't accept null for its parameter. That's a bit odd. And that's because we don't get this initialize method called at all. So let's go... Where should we go? We should go to the game controller, and here after base.initialize call player.initialize. There we go. And of course it's still a little bit buggy. So we go to the game controller, load content, and player.load content. And there we go. Actually, the update is a bit laggy because of my video recording stuff going on there. So it just goes jick, 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 jick. And that isn't the way it should work, but it should be a lot smoother for you. Actually, one thing is we have these update calls here. You never should leave any of these. Where are they? Let's take these right lines because they lag your project so much. And here we go. It's a lot smoother now. So this is basically what we ended up in the first part, and now in the second part we did the exactly same thing, but in a lot more complicated fashion. Now, you may think now that this is all just a bunch of bullshit and you shouldn't do this. Actually, that's wrong. You should do everything like I did here, because now you can easily just go into player class. You don't have to search for variables through all your code. Just go to player and here's the initial position. I can just go and if I want to position my player to the top left corner. I just put 0, 0 there and start the game, and there we go. It's in the top left corner. It's a lot more easier to control your game project this way. In the next part, I think we should dive more into the game screen system and see how it works. But this concludes our part 2. We saw how to construct our game project the way that it's made of little chunks and small components that work seamlessly together. And this way we get a nice clean project which is easy to customize as we like. And also we saw some bugs and exceptions there. It's normal and you will get them sooner or later. And I just showed you how to fix these little problems. If you like this tutorial, give it a like, and if you would like to see more game development related videos, you can subscribe to GDVlog and get updates for all the upcoming videos. This is GDVlog, thank you for watching.